So I wanted to take everyone through a bit of a challenge I'm finding with using Next.js, particularly about caching on server-side rendering. What's happening is that, and I feel like a lot of people have had this issue where the client, the local client, is caching very aggressively. Let me draw a diagram to kind of show this in action. Server component, and this is the client here. The client will render the server component, but before it does that, it needs to request the data for that server component. So what we'll see here is the client first hits that JavaScript and it's like, okay, I need to fetch that component. Specifically in the app router is where this occurs. So let's say we need to fetch that component, and then the server will need to fetch some data from the database to render into that component. This could be something like a shopping cart, for example, where the user has filled items in their cart, and you need to reload those items when the user reaches that page again in the future. Awesome. So this is the final kind of schematic for normal data fetches where the user has completely refreshed the page. The component loads, they fetch some data, the data is given by the database, the server then renders that server component, putting the fetched data into it, and then the client receives that server component and renders. Now, the error happens, or the issue happens, when this server component has, the issue really happens when the server component needs to be remounted in the same session. So when the user has not refreshed the page fully, even with Next.js navigation, if the user navigated to another page using the Next.js navigation and then navigates back to the original page, that original page does not reload. So what that means is that, and I'll visualize this. So the client is over here, right? Let's say that the client requests the homepage first. Oh, wait, actually, let's do it with the shopping cart. So let's say cart, right? So they request the cart page that then goes to the server and that fetches the data for the cart. Let's say they go to a completely different page, and we can ignore the tree here. This will be a separate tree. But then let's go, the client then goes back to the cart page. And this is all done through Next.js. What happens is that here, actually, Next.js is putting this into a store. What's happening here is the Next.js is actually storing that data. So when the request comes in for /cart again, all it does is it goes to that store of data and fetches it again. Now, this has got nothing to do with servers caching the data. If we want to revalidate this part, we can do that. We can actually do that with the revalidate. That's where that's really useful. The challenge is that if we want to do this part again, where we're fetching that data from the server, as far as I know, unless you reload the page, that cannot be done. So the only way to go through this whole sequence of events is to reload the page. So let me create a new Next.js app, and then I'll show you. So we've got a basic Next.js app set up. Now I'm going to create a folder called profile and set up just a redirect so that we can test this out. So I've made a basic profile page and I've made a basic home page. The home page, all it does is it grabs a random number and then renders that in. And then the profile page, all that does is that it links back to the home page. Let me show you what the behavior is of this small but very crucial app. So if I go to this page, let's just go back to the home page here. You'll see that there is a random number here. Now, if I click this and I go back to the home page, you'll see that that random number does not change. And I can keep doing this over and over again, and that random number will stay the same. What does that mean? That means that if you're fetching from an API within React, within the server components, and then your client doesn't exactly refresh. Maybe they navigate to a different screen, and then when they come back to that original screen, the data on it will stay the same, even if the new screen has changed that data. Now, let me show you how Next.js says we should potentially mitigate this. Now, to mitigate this, what Next.js tells us to do is to invalidate when this button is hit. So when this button is hit, or even when this, I'll just do it when the page is hit. But when the page is hit, Next.js tells us to invalidate the other page. So I've done two things. I've revalidated the path, as well as in this other one, I've set revalidate to 0. These are both recommended. I'll even do the other recommendation, which is to use segment config options, one of them being dynamic. So we'll also set that as well. Now let me show you the behavior with all three of those enabled. I have saved the file. I'm going to refresh the page, and you can see that there's a new random number generated every time I refresh. Now let's go ahead and click the button, and you'll see that that number does not change. So if I share the documentation here, this doesn't work because force dynamic should override everything else. Even revalidate doesn't work. And not only that, but also if you go revalidate path here, that doesn't work either. So that doesn't actually revalidate that path on the client side. The only thing that actually works is replacing all these links with A's, which means that they reload the entire page. Cool, I've replaced them with A's. Let's reload the page, get a new number generated. Click this, new number. Click this, go back, new number. That is what I have found. If you're navigating using Next Router, exact same problem. You'll have to use a window.href redirect instead of using the Next Router. And link component does not work with this way of thinking. The issue also stems that if you're using that server component again, so let's say you're using the same component in multiple places, which happens, which is quite a common pattern, then that component can be rendered again a second time, and it's cached from the first time that the app was rendering it. So the whole result is incorrect. This happens when, say, you've got a shopping cart app. At the start, you have all the items populated into the shopping cart. They go to the next screen and they select to delete certain items from the shopping cart, which they can do. And then that's a different component. And then they go to a checkout screen where they're presented with the same shopping cart component as the initial screen. What happens there is that the shopping cart carries over from the initial screen, and the changes that were made to the cart don't actually get changed. They're not actually changed in that final screen. So then customers get confused, being like, hey, I removed these items. Why are they still there? Well, because Next.js has been caching these from the main screen. So this is a very, very big issue. And I feel like we haven't hit a situation where this is, I guess, easily fixable. Or even if you're designing an application, it's very likely that you're going to run into this, because there's a lot of different ways where users navigate to a certain page and then they navigate back to the original page, expecting that data has changed based on what they enter. A simple form, for example, or a simple CRM kind of database system where they enter in new entries, they expect that when they get back to that initial screen, that component changes. If it doesn't, that's really, really weird behavior. So I think in this case, I would recommend that check out other ways to do it. I'd recommend Remix, which is what I'm going to try next. And in part 2, you can stay tuned and we'll try out Remix together. And see if it fixes this issue. But it is quite a big issue with Next.js, the app router at the moment.